If this story touches your heart, please like and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing these important stories that remind us of the power of community and compassion. Rain hammered against the emergency room windows of St. Mary's Hospital as Dr. Helen Carter updated patient charts at the nurses' station. The automatic doors slid open with a whoosh, letting in a cold gust that carried the smell of wet asphalt. "We need help here," called a man's voice. Helen rushed toward the entrance where John and Mary Dawson stood supporting a tiny figure between them, a frail little girl with half-undone braids, her small hands pressed against her stomach. "I'm Dr. Carter," Helen said, kneeling to the child's level. "What's your name, sweetheart?" The girl looked up with pain-filled eyes but remained silent. "Her name's Sophie," Mary explained. "We're her neighbors. Found her alone, crying on her porch. She was doubled over like this." "Where are her parents?" Helen asked, guiding them toward an exam room. The couple exchanged glances. "We don't know," John admitted. "We've been seeing her alone a lot lately." Helen noticed Sophie's clothes, a faded pink t-shirt, several sizes too large and jeans secured with a safety pin. The child's cheekbones were too pronounced, her wrists too delicate. "Sophie, I'm going to check your tummy. Can you show me where it hurts the most?" Sophie pointed to her lower right side, then whispered, "It hurts again. It always hurts. When I'm hungry for too long." "When did you last eat something?" Helen asked, carefully examining her abdomen. "Yesterday morning, I had cereal, but the milk was gone after that." "And has anyone been home with you today?" Sophie shook her head. "Mommy has to work a lot. She leaves me food, but I ate it all already." While the nurse took Sophie's vitals, Helen spoke quietly with the neighbors. "We've been worried about her," Mary confessed. "Sometimes we hear her crying through the walls. We've invited her over for dinner when we see her alone, but her mother told us to mind our business." Initial assessment confirmed Helen's suspicions. Sophie was underweight and showing signs of malnutrition. Her abdomen was distended despite her thin frame. When the nurse brought a juice box and crackers, Sophie just held the juice with both hands, staring at it as if afraid it might disappear. "It's okay," Helen assured her. "These are for you." As Sophie sipped the apple juice, Helen noticed calluses on her small hands, the kind that came from household work, not play. "Sophie, do you take care of yourself a lot when your mom is working?" The girl nodded, clutching the juice box like a treasure. "I can make sandwiches and clean up and everything, and I know how to be very quiet so the neighbors don't complain." Just as Sophie finished her crackers, she doubled over again, a small cry escaping her lips. "My tummy," she gasped, grasping Helen's sleeve with surprising strength. "It's doing the bad hurt now." The monitors showed her heart rate spiking. Helen called for immediate assistance. As the medical team rushed in, Sophie looked up with fear in her eyes. "Please don't send me home again. Last time the doctor did, and nobody came back for 3 whole days." The entire room froze. The monitors kept beeping, but no one moved. The neighbors held hands. The nurse blinked back tears. And Dr. Helen Carter realized that this child wasn't just asking for medical help. She was begging for safety. In the silence that followed, Helen gently brushed a strand of hair from Sophie's forehead and made a silent promise. Perhaps this would be the last night Sophie would have to face the world alone. The pediatric ward was quiet at 3 a.m., save for the rhythmic beeping of machines and the soft padding of nurses' shoes on linoleum. Sophie slept fitfully under thin hospital blankets, an IV drip delivering fluids to her dehydrated body. Dr. Helen Carter sat at the nurses' station, rubbing her tired eyes as she studied the test results that had just come in. "This can't be right," she muttered, comparing 2 different reports. Nurse Jenkins looked up from her charting. "What is it, Dr. Carter?" "Sophie's blood work shows severe anemia, vitamin deficiencies, and elevated liver enzymes. But look at this ultrasound." Helen pointed to the screen. "See this mass near her appendix? It's not appendicitis like I initially thought." The nurse leaned closer. "What is it then?" Bowel obstruction." Likely caused by severe, prolonged constipation. Helen's voice tightened. This happens when children don't get proper nutrition or enough fluids for extended periods. It's entirely preventable with basic care. Helen glanced toward Sophie's room where the little girl had finally fallen into deep sleep after hours of pain and fear. The hospital gown made her look even smaller, drowning in fabric meant for children twice her size. We'll need to start her on a special diet once she's stabilized, Helen continued. And I'm concerned about these other markers. Her immune system is compromised. She's probably been fighting minor infections for months without treatment. Helen's mind flashed to Sophie's earlier words. Last time the doctor did, and nobody came back for 3 whole days. Had Sophie been brought to a doctor before? Were there records somewhere? Jenkins, can you check if Sophie has any previous medical history in our system? Or any other hospitals in the county? While the nurse searched the database, Helen reviewed Sophie's physical exam notes. The calluses on her hands, the uneven wear on her teeth suggesting she wasn't brushing regularly, the slight delay in responding to questions, possibly from fatigue or cognitive impacts of malnutrition. Nothing in our system, Jenkins reported, but I found something in the county records. A Sophie Wilson, age 6, was brought to Riverside Urgent Care 4 months ago. Diagnosis was stomach ache, possible flu. Discharged with instructions for rest and fluids. Helen frowned. Any follow-up? None documented. It was a different doctor each time. No red flags noted. Helen felt a familiar knot of frustration. How many warning signs had been missed? How many times had Sophie been sent back to an empty house? Just then, Mary Dawson appeared at the door of the ward carrying a small backpack. I hope it's okay, she said softly. I went to Sophie's apartment to get some of her things. Her door was still unlocked. I found her stuffed rabbit, thought she might want it when she wakes up. Helen accepted the worn toy, noting its careful stitching where it had been repaired multiple times. Has her mother returned? Helen asked. Mary shook her head. No sign of her, but I found this on their kitchen counter. She handed Helen a wrinkled note. Sophie, back Thursday. Sandwiches in fridge. Do not go outside. Do not answer door. Today is Saturday, Helen said quietly. As if on cue, Sophie stirred in her sleep, her small face contorting in discomfort. Helen moved quickly to her bedside, checking her IV and adjusting her blanket. The little girl's eyes fluttered. Open, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar surroundings. Then she spotted the stuffed rabbit in Helen's hands. A spark of recognition lit her tired eyes. Mr. Hops, she whispered, reaching out with trembling fingers. Your neighbor, Mrs. Dawson, brought him for you, Helen said, tucking the well-loved rabbit beside Sophie. Sophie clutched the toy to her chest. He gets hungry too sometimes, she murmured sleepily. I always save him the last bite. Helen swallowed hard against the lump forming in her throat. As Sophie drifted back to sleep, Helen made a decision. This child would not fall through the cracks again, not on her watch. By Sunday afternoon, Sophie was resting more comfortably. Dr. Helen Carter stood by the window of the small hospital room, phone pressed to her ear as she spoke in hushed tones. Yes, that's right. Rebecca Wilson, mother of Sophie Wilson, age 6. Helen glanced at the sleeping child. She hasn't returned home since Thursday. As Helen ended the call, a woman in scrubs approached. Dr. Carter, I'm Diane from Social Services. Helen led her to a quiet corner. Thank you for coming on a Sunday. Cases like this don't take weekends off, Diane replied, opening her laptop. Rebecca Wilson, 32, single mother. No prior cases with us, but she was in the system herself as a child. Employment? 3 jobs, morning diner shift, afternoon cleaning service, and night stocking. Minimal benefits, subsidized apartment, no child support. Helen's anger towards Sophie's mother softened. 3 jobs and still struggling to feed her child. The working poor fall through every crack. Diane sighed. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion. A thin woman with dark circles under her eyes was arguing with the nurse. My daughter. They said she was brought here. Helen approached. Ms. Wilson, I'm Dr. Carter. I've been treating Sophie. Rebecca's eyes darted nervously between Helen and Diane. Is she okay? I got home and the neighbors said, she's stable now, Helen said. But she's been very ill, malnutrition, dehydration. She told us she'd been alone since Thursday. Rebecca's shoulders slumped. My car broke down in Riverside. Couldn't afford the tow. Had to pick up extra shifts. Stayed with a coworker. Her voice cracked. I left her food. Called Mrs. Peterson downstairs to check on her. Mrs. Peterson has been in Florida for 2 weeks, Helen said gently. Rebecca pressed her palms against her eyes. I didn't know. I thought she was watching her. Ms. Wilson, Diane said, Sophie's condition indicates long-term neglect. You think I don't know that? Rebecca whispered fiercely. You think I want to work? Myself to death while my daughter sits alone. Daycare waiting lists are 2 years. After-school programs all have fees. My mother's dead. My sister's battling her own demons. She looked up, eyes glistening. I'm doing the best I can. In Sophie's room, the little girl was awake now. When she saw her mother, her eyes lit up briefly, then clouded. Mommy, am I in trouble? Rebecca rushed to her daughter. No, baby. I'm the one in trouble. I'm so sorry. As mother and daughter embraced, Helen caught Diane's eye. The social worker's expression was professional but pained. They both knew what came next. Mandatory reporting, possible temporary removal. Later, Rebecca looked up from her paperwork. The worst part is I was almost there. Got approved for that nursing assistant program. Better job, better hours, better pay. That's still possible, Helen said carefully. Rebecca's smile was sad. Not if they take her away. And they will, won't they? Helen couldn't offer false comfort. The system isn't perfect, but there are people who care, including me. As she walked away, Helen wondered how many other families were out there. Just one broken-down car away from crisis. The Tuesday. Morning staff meeting at St. Mary's Hospital began with Sophie's case. Helen stood before her colleagues. Doctors, nurses, and social workers gathered in the conference room. A photo of Sophie's ultrasound displayed on the screen behind her. She's responding well to treatment, Helen explained. The, obstruction is resolving without surgery. However, she'll need continued care and monitoring after discharge. Dr. Thompson, the hospital administrator, frowned. And the mother's situation? Rebecca Wilson works 3 jobs to make ends meet, Helen replied. She's cooperative but overwhelmed. Social services is involved, but the foster care system is already strained. Sophie could end up in a group home. Nurse Jenkins spoke up. Dr. Carter, those neighbors who brought Sophie in, the Dawsons, have been visiting daily. They seem genuinely concerned. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Mary Dawson stood there, looking determined despite her obvious discomfort at interrupting. I'm sorry, but I heard you were discussing Sophie. We, that is, several neighbors in our apartment building, wanted to offer some help. Helen invited her in, curious. We've talked it over, Mary continued. John and I can watch Sophie after school until Rebecca gets home from her first job. Mrs. Garcia on the 3rd floor offered to take morning shifts. Mr. Lee, the retired teacher in 2B, said he could help with homework. The room fell silent, surprised by this unexpected development. You're proposing a community child care arrangement? Diane from Social Services asked. Mary nodded. We should have done this sooner. We all saw a child alone but didn't connect the dots, not until it was almost too late. Later that day, Helen accompanied Mary back to the apartment, building where a small group had gathered in the communal laundry room. John Dawson was there with an elderly couple, a middle-aged man with reading glasses and a young woman bouncing a toddler on her hip. This is Dr. Carter, Mary introduced. She's been caring for Sophie. Mrs. Garcia, the elderly woman, stepped forward. My Carlos and I raised 5 children. Our grandkids are grown now. Our apartment is always open. I'm home all day, added Mr. Lee, the retired teacher. I could help with homework, maybe even some extra tutoring. She's falling behind in school. The young mother, with the toddler, spoke next. I've got plenty of hand-me-downs that would fit Sophie, and Emma would love a playmate when I watch her. Helen felt a tightness in her throat. This is very generous, but it would be a significant commitment. That's why we made this, John said, unfolding a handwritten schedule. We've worked out a rotation. No one person has to shoulder too much. Helen studied the careful planning, each day mapped out, contingencies noted, even emergency contact information listed. Rebecca would need to agree, she cautioned. Of course, Mary said, we don't want to. We don't overstep. We just want her to know she's not alone. Back at the hospital, Helen found Rebecca sitting beside Sophie's bed, helping her with a puzzle. The little girl looked better. Some color had returned to her cheeks, and she smiled as she snapped pieces into place. When Helen explained the neighbor's proposal, Rebecca's expression cycled through disbelief, suspicion, and finally, cautious hope. Why would they do this? She asked quietly, so Sophie couldn't hear. They barely know us. Sometimes it takes a crisis for people to realize they're connected, Helen replied. They saw themselves in your struggle. Rebecca wiped away a tear. I don't know if I can accept this much help. Think of it as community, Helen suggested, not charity. That evening, the neighbors returned, bringing homemade soup, coloring books for Sophie, and, most precious of all, a message board for Rebecca's apartment door where she could leave notes about Sophie's schedule and needs. As Sophie happily showed Mr. Lee her favorite puzzle, Helen observed the quiet transformation taking place. Strangers becoming something like family, building a safety net where the system had failed. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't permanent. But for now, it was enough to catch one falling child. 3 weeks after her admission to St. Mary's, Sophie was due to be discharged. Her treatment had gone well. The bowel obstruction had resolved, her lab values were improving, and she had gained nearly 2 pounds. The community childcare schedule was in place, and Rebecca had arranged a modified work schedule that allowed her to be home more evenings. Dr. Helen Carter completed her final rounds, smiling as she entered Sophie's room to find the little girl coloring with Mary Dawson. Good morning, Sophie. How are you feeling today? Good, Sophie replied, looking up from her drawing. My tummy doesn't hurt anymore. Helen checked Sophie's chart, nodding with satisfaction. Your latest tests look excellent. I think you're ready to go home today. Sophie's smile faltered slightly. I like it here. Everyone's nice. They'll be nice at home, too, Helen assured her. Remember the schedule we talked about? Mrs. Garcia will make you breakfast, Mr. Lee will help with homework, and the Dawsons will play games with you until your mom gets home. Sophie nodded, but her eyes darted nervously around the room. As Helen completed the final examination, she noticed something concerning. Sophie's temperature was slightly elevated at 99.8 degrees, and her lymph nodes were swollen. Sophie, does your throat hurt at all? The little girl shook her head, then hesitated. Maybe a little, but I don't want to. Stay longer. Helen kept her voice casual. Let me just check one more thing. A quick throat swab confirmed her suspicion. Strep throat. Normally a simple infection to treat, but potentially dangerous for a child with Sophie's compromised immune system. I'm afraid we need to keep you for one more day, Helen explained gently. You have a throat infection that needs antibiotics. Sophie's face crumpled. But Mom took off work to get me today. She'll lose money. The worry in a 6-year-old's voice about her mother's finances squeezed Helen's heart. Rebecca arrived an hour later, breathless and concerned. Helen explained the situation in the hallway. Strep isn't usually serious, but with her weakened condition, I'm concerned about complications like rheumatic fever or kidney inflammation. We need to be cautious. Rebecca nodded, her face drawn with worry. Whatever she needs. That night, Sophie's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her fever spiked to 103 degrees, and she developed a rash across her torso. When Helen received the urgent page at 2 a.m., she rushed to the hospital to find Sophie delirious with fever, her breathing labored. Scarlet fever, Helen diagnosed immediately. It's a complication of strep. Her body doesn't have the reserves to fight this off. The next hours were critical. Helen ordered IV antibiotics, fluids, and close monitoring. Sophie drifted in and out of consciousness, calling for her mother in moments of lucidity. By morning, the hospital. Grapevine had spread word of Sophie's crisis. The Dawsons arrived with fresh clothes for Rebecca, who had spent the night in a chair by Sophie's bed. Mr. Lee brought books to read when Sophie woke up. Mrs. Garcia delivered a thermos of homemade chicken soup for when the little one is ready. Sophie's fever continued to rage throughout the day despite aggressive treatment. Her small body, already weakened by months of malnutrition, struggled to fight the infection. By evening, Helen noticed an alarming new symptom. Sophie's fingertips had a bluish tinge, indicating poor circulation. "We need to transfer her to pediatric intensive care," Helen told Rebecca, keeping her voice steady despite her growing fear. Her body is under tremendous strain. As they prepared for the transfer, Sophie briefly regained consciousness, her eyes glassy with fever. She clutched her mother's hand. "Don't leave," she whispered. "Never," Rebecca promised, her voice breaking. In the pediatric ICU, monitors beeped incessantly as Sophie's vital signs fluctuated. Her oxygen levels dipped dangerously, requiring supplemental oxygen. The pediatric specialists conferred with Helen over Sophie's case, their expressions grave. "The next 12 hours will be critical," the attending physician told Rebecca. "Her system is overwhelmed." Helen stayed past the end of her shift, checking Sophie's charts and conferring with the night staff. As she finally prepared to leave around midnight, she found Rebecca in the hallway outside the ICU, sobbing quietly. "This is my fault," Rebecca whispered. "If I'd been home more, noticed earlier." Helen placed a hand on her shoulder. "Blame won't help Sophie now. She needs you strong." As Helen drove home in the darkness, exhaustion washing over her, her phone rang. It was the hospital. Sophie's condition had worsened. She was being intubated to help her breathe. Helen turned her car around, heart pounding. The little girl who had whispered, "It hurts again," had fought so hard for so long. She couldn't give up now, not when she finally had people fighting alongside her. The fluorescent lights of the hospital conference room cast harsh shadows as Helen sat across from Diane and her supervisor from social services. The formal letter between them bore the county seal and an imposing letterhead. "Notice of Child Welfare Investigation. We don't question your medical judgment, Dr. Carter," the supervisor, Mr. Patterson, said. "But protocol mandates removal to temporary foster care when neglect has resulted in life-threatening conditions." Sophie had stabilized after 3 harrowing days in the PICU. She was breathing on her own again, the infection finally responding to treatment. But this victory now faced a new threat. "Sophie needs consistent medical follow-up and a stable environment," Helen argued. "Placing her with strangers now could be traumatic, especially after what she's endured." Diane shifted uncomfortably. "The community care plan is admirable but unofficial. We need licensed providers, background checks. Those take time," Helen interrupted. "Sophie's being discharged next week. The neighbors have already reorganized their lives to help." Mr. Patterson folded his hands. "The mother's history concerns us. Multiple jobs, unstable schedule, previous failure to seek medical attention. We have to consider the child's best interests. Her best interest is to remain with her mother who loves her, with community support," Helen insisted. "Rebecca has reduced her hours, enrolled in that nursing program. She's doing everything right." "With all due respect, Dr. Carter, you're overstepping. Medical decisions are your domain. Placement decisions are ours." Helen felt her professional composure slipping. "I've treated Sophie for weeks. I've seen her terror at being separated from her mother. I've witnessed her neighbors rallying around her family. That should count for something." The meeting ended in stalemate. As Helen walked the hospital corridors afterward, her frustration built with each step. The system designed to protect children was about to inflict a different kind of harm. In Sophie's room, Rebecca sat reading a book about butterflies. Her daughter nestled against her side. Both looked up when Helen entered. "How was the meeting?" Rebecca asked quietly, her eyes already knowing the answer. "They're still pushing for temporary removal," Helen admitted, sitting on the edge of the bed. "But it's not settled." Rebecca's face remained calm for Sophie's benefit, but her knuckles whitened around the book. "How long?" 6 months minimum. Then reevaluation." Sophie looked between them with the uncanny perception of children who've learned to read adult tensions. "Are they taking me away from Mommy?" Before either could answer, a knock at the door revealed Mary and John Dawson, along with Mr. Lee and Mrs. Garcia. They'd arrived for their daily visit, arms laden with cards from neighborhood children, fresh fruit, and hand-sewn pajamas for Sophie. Seeing Rebecca's distress, Mary immediately understood. "The social workers decided?" Rebecca nodded mutely. The neighbors exchanged glances. Then Mr. Lee, the retired teacher, stepped forward with unexpected authority. "Dr. Carter, would a petition help? I've contacted everyone in our building, 23. Families have signed, all vouching for our community care plan." Helen felt a flicker of hope. It might. Patterson values community input. "What about an official kinship placement?" Mrs. Garcia suggested. "In my country, neighbors are considered extended family in emergencies." Later that evening, Helen paced her office, making calls to colleagues in family court, the hospital ethics committee, and finally to a law professor friend who specialized in child welfare cases. Each conversation added another piece to a possible solution. At midnight, she drafted a formal appeal outlining an alternative care plan that combined medical oversight with community support. It wasn't perfect. Bureaucracy rarely allowed for perfect, but it might be enough to keep Sophie with her mother while ensuring her safety. As Helen finally drove home in the early morning hours, she reflected on the irony. The system created to prevent children from falling through the cracks was itself full of rigid, unbending procedures. Sometimes healing required more than medicine or regulations. It required people willing to stand in the gaps. Tomorrow would bring another battle with paperwork and procedures. But tonight Sophie slept safely, her mother at her side and a community standing watch. A different kind of medicine, perhaps the kind she needed most. 6 months after Sophie Wilson first arrived at St. Mary's Hospital, Dr. Helen Carter sat in the small courtroom, watching as Judge Martinez reviewed the final documents. "Based on the reports before me, I'm approving the family maintenance plan," the judge announced. "Sophie will remain in her mother's custody with continued community support and quarterly check-ins from social services." Rebecca squeezed Sophie's hand, tears of relief streaming down her face. Around them sat their makeshift family, the Dawsons, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Garcia, and several other neighbors whose lives had become intertwined with theirs. Outside the courthouse, autumn leaves swirled around them as Helen approached mother and daughter. "Congratulations," she said simply. Sophie, now 7 and noticeably healthier, smiled up at her. "Does this mean we won?" "It means the plan worked," Helen corrected gently. "Everyone working together is what made the difference." The past 6 months hadn't been perfect. There had been setbacks. Rebecca had struggled with the nursing program while balancing work and parenting. Sophie had needed additional medical follow-ups for her compromised immune system. The community schedule had occasionally faltered when emergencies arose, but they had adapted. When Mrs. Garcia fell ill, others adjusted their hours. When Rebecca needed extra study time, Mr. Lee offered weekend tutoring for both mother and daughter. The apartment building's community room had been transformed into a shared homework and dinner space where families rotated cooking duties. "We're having a celebration. Dinner tonight," Mary Dawson said. "Nothing fancy, just everyone bringing something to share." Helen smiled. "I might stop by if that's okay." Later that evening, Helen arrived at the apartment building to find the community room transformed. Tables pushed together formed one long dining space, covered with mismatched dishes. Children darted between adults, their laughter echoing against the walls now decorated with artwork, much of it Sophie's. Rebecca greeted her at the door. She looked different, still tired, but steadier somehow, more confident. "I'm glad you came," she said, leading Helen to the food table. "Sophie's been asking for you." Helen spotted the little girl showing another child how to fold paper cranes. Her hair was neatly braided, her cheeks full and pink. When she saw Helen, she rushed over. "Dr. Carter, I got an A on my science project about the human digestive system." Helen laughed. "That's wonderful. You're becoming a doctor already." As dinner began, Helen observed the scene. People from different backgrounds passing dishes, checking on each other's children, sharing news of job interviews and school events. This wasn't charity, it was community in its truest form. Mr. Lee tapped his glass for attention. "A toast," he announced. "6 months ago, we were strangers sharing a building. Today, we're something more." "To neighbors," someone called out. "To friends," added another. Rebecca stood, her voice steady despite her emotion. "2 second chances. And to all of you who reminded me that asking for help isn't weakness, it's how we survive." After dinner, as Sophie helped clear plates, Helen found Rebecca by the window. "How's the nursing program?" "Challenging, but good. I finished my first clinical rotation last week." "And the new schedule?" "Working days only has changed everything," Rebecca admitted. "We have evenings together now." As Helen prepared to leave, Sophie appeared with a carefully wrapped package. "I made this for you," she said shyly. Inside was a homemade card. On the front, a crayon drawing of Sophie holding hands with various stick figures, her mother, the neighbors, and a figure in a white coat. Inside, in careful handwriting, "Thank you for listening when it hurt." Helen knelt to Sophie's level. "You're very welcome. How does your tummy feel these days?" Sophie thought for a moment. "Sometimes it still hurts a little, but now I tell someone right away, and it gets better faster." As Helen drove home, she reflected on all she'd witnessed. The system wasn't fixed. Too many children still fell through its cracks. But Sophie's story offered a different model. Not perfect, not permanent perhaps, but something real and sustainable. Sometimes healing came not from institutions, but from neighbors checking on neighbors, from shared meals and homework help, from a community willing to see a child's pain and respond with something more powerful than paperwork, genuine care. And sometimes, the most important medicine of all was simply being heard when it hurt.